Hello lovely people, so I do have the EZY DSP installed, everything is ready, and today we're gonna start tuning with it. And we're gonna start with a very basic thing, which is crossovers and time alignment. So I will be using a laptop for this because it has a bigger screen, so it's just better for you to see what I'm doing rather on a small phone screen. So I have a USB cable going there, everything is like that. So let's go inside, let's make ourselves comfortable, and let's see what we have. So this series of videos, I'm gonna shut the door, is gonna be extremely user-friendly. I'm gonna try to explain everything as simple as possible in order for everyone to understand. So before we start, one thing is I forgot actually to do it, and I'm gonna tell you why. So the source that is coming into the DSP, in my case, it is going to be a coax cable, which is a digital signal from the head unit. Before initial setup, before we start doing anything, I'm going to disconnect it because I don't want any signal going into the DSP. If I'm going to start a fresh tune with no crossovers, nothing, and for some reason head unit is going to start playing music, I might burn my tweeters. So before you start, either disconnect the speakers or just disconnect the source, so only the DSP is going to be connected to the amplifier, because we want to set up the DSP first before we play literally anything. Okay, so I'm going to turn on the ignition. Just like that, the hinge is gonna come on and the DSP is gonna be on. So I'm gonna fire up the app, the program for the DSP. Recognition, connected, data. Okay, so this is my previous tune that I did because I was running with this for a week. So what I'm gonna do is file, load machine preset, and I'm gonna load just randomly preset number 3. And this preset is gonna be fresh, absolutely fresh. There's nothing on it. I'm gonna maximize the window, and just like that. So before we start, I do have an affiliate link. If you want to buy anything from Down for Sound webpage, you can use that link. It's gonna help me a lot. I'm gonna leave it in the video description, and thank you in advance. If you want to know how to use this, I have a separate video how to use this software and what everything does. So in that video, I go through every single button. And in this one, we're gonna touch the crossovers, because the crossover is the most important thing when you're just starting to set up everything. And this series of videos are going to be, as I mentioned, beginner friendly, and we're going to start with a typical two-way. So my typical two-way is going to be tweeters in the sills and mid bass in the doors. We are going to imagine for now, for today, that we have a subwoofer in the back. That is, I'm going to put a different subwoofer that I have now because I want something more relatable to you. So as the first tune is going to be two-way front plus subwoofer in the back and nothing else. Later on, we're going to touch the three-way, we're going to add the front subwoofer, we're going to add the rears and everything else. So today we're going to talk about crossovers. Now crossovers, you've probably seen something here. They're here at the bottom, and you can choose the frequency, you can choose the slope, and we can choose the type. So what is the purpose of a crossover in general? The purpose of a crossover, it depends if it's a high pass or a low pass. If we're talking about a high pass crossover, which is this one, HPF, this crossover allows, if you set a certain frequency, let's actually set something. Let's set a frequency of 1000 Hertz, just like that, so that we can visually actually see. So this crossover basically cuts all the bottom end and lets through all the signal that is above 1000 Hertz. Now this crossover, the high pass crossover, is much more important than the low pass crossover, because the high pass crossover, it's a safety thing, it's a safety feature, and it protects any kind of driver from over excursion, from distortion, and from just literally blowing it up. So the high pass filter is your safety net. Now, if we're talking about tweeters, you might have heard some people say like bass blockers or capacitors or a passive crossovers and that kind of stuff. All those things is the same thing. It's just a high pass filter that protects the tweeter from bottoming it out and from blowing. Now, just a heads up, when we're going to talk about all the system, and since we have the DSP, we will be talking about running fully active. That means that we don't have any passive crossovers anywhere in the system. Now, some people say that I want to have a cap just for tweeter, just as a protection in case like DSP blows or something. Me personally, in 3 years that I'm doing car audio, I never used a capacitor and I don't feel the need for it. Like, I don't know, guys, if you want to use 2 condoms, go for it, whatever floats your boat. But me personally, if I have a DSP and it is a reliable piece of gear, I don't feel the need to use any capacitor. If the DSP is gonna blow, the tweeters are gonna be the least of your worries, but that is not gonna happen. So now that we established that a high pass filter is supposed to protect the driver, any kind of driver, now we need to talk about what values should we choose, because in the software you can see we can choose the frequency, we can choose the slope, and we can choose the type of the crossover. Now the frequency is kind of self-explanatory, like whatever frequency you choose, the crossover appears there. So if I choose like 4000 hertz, is going to appear close to 4000 hertz. Now, bear in mind that the frequency at which crossover is set, it doesn't mean that if I set 4K, it doesn't mean that a driver is going to play down to 4K and nothing after. A crossover is not a brick wall. It is a gradual roll off of those frequencies. If you set a crossover 4K, the driver is still going to play 2K because it's going to be just very, very low, depending on the slope, obviously. So this is, for some reasons, 48. Let's put a shallower slope like 12. We can see it a bit better. There we go. So we can see that if I set crossover 4K, it still plays 2K. It's still going to play 1K, just the level is going to be much, much lower. And you can see that the 4K point is not at the very top. The crossover starts to cut frequencies even before the crossover point. So bear in mind that a crossover point is not like a fixed thing that a driver, as I mentioned, plays up to that and nothing else. It is a gradual roll-off. Now, the crossover point, the actual frequency, the level, which is in this case minus 6 dB, is going to depend on the crossover type. So Linkwitz-Riley at the crossover frequency, you see it's already minus 6 dB. If I'm going to choose a different type, let's choose Butterworth. The Butterworth at the crossover frequency 4K, it's minus 3 dB. So the crossover type is just a different kind of shape of the slope. If we're going to choose a bezel, just like that, it's even higher than that. So you can see different types of crossovers is just a different shape of the crossover. The most safest crossover from the all is the Linkwitz-Riley because it cuts the most. And in car audio, probably you heard that what you want to use is 24 dB, which is the 4th order Linkwitz-Riley, which is this one. And this is going to be the safest crossover that you can. Now, if you're going to apply much steeper ones like this 48, it looks like a brick wall, but then it's very hard to pull the drivers together when you have such a steep crossover. So as a beginner, we're always going to use 24 dB Linkwitz-Riley crossovers. Now, at this point, in the very initial setup, when I'm going to set up only the crossovers, don't think about phase or that kind of stuff or anything else. That we're going to touch later on, and I'm going to explain everything for you. This is just very, very basic, very beginning, just to set your crossovers that they will be safe. Now, we kind of determined that Linkwitz-Riley 24 dB is kind of the safest crossover type. Now, the question is, what frequency should we choose for each drivers? That highly depends on the actual driver. Some drivers that are much better, they can handle lower crossover points. So if we're talking about the tweeter, so let's take, for example, a tweeter, which is in a normal two-way, 1.5 inch or whatever the size is. A normal typical tweeter probably is going to play down to 3.5K. Now again, it's going to vary greatly depending on the tweeter. Some cheaper tweeters, they will need a higher crossover point, maybe like 4-5K or something. So for this one, let's put 3.5 just to show you how it looks like. 3500 and this. So this is like a normal crossover point for a typical 1.5-inch tweeter. I do have a separate video about how to choose a crossover point in extreme detail, where you can take the distortion measurement of a driver and see how it performs. So I know that in my system, based on distortion data, this tweeter can be crossed about 2.4K. and is going to be perfectly fine. Now, if we're talking about a bigger tweeter like that one, that is the SB Acoustics SB29, it is a home tweeter, it is a bigger one. This can be crossed all the way down to 2000 Hertz and is going to play with no issues at all. If you have a smaller tweeter, if you have like a very cheap set, maybe a piezo tweeter or whatever, those will need a much higher crossover. Now, you can achieve a similar result if you're going to use a shallower slope and a higher frequency. So let's, for example, we chose 3.5K 24 dB. If I can choose, for example, 5K, and I'm gonna do a shallower slope, 12 dB, something like that, this is gonna give a similar protection as the previous slope. So basically almost doubling the frequency, and you make the slope shallower. This is kind of useful if you wanna cut some pesky frequencies that are kind of harsh, but for those kind of adjustments, we're going to talk in the upcoming videos when we're going to touch the EQ part, because in this one, we're not going to talk about EQ. This is just literally just set up the crossovers. So bear in mind, you can use a shallower crossover. However, for the beginner, I always going to recommend use 24 dB link with Riley, and we're going to use 3.5 for now. If you have like bullet tweeters will need a much higher crossover, probably like 5 or 6,000 Hertz, but I would still recommend using 24 dB. Now, you know, there's a floating rule online that a good crossover point for a tweeter is double the FS. So FS is the free resonance frequency of a driver, any kind of driver. And if a tweeter has an FS of like 1,500 Hertz, 2 times FS, 3,000 Hertz is going to be the lowest recommended crossover for your driver. That's kind of true, and it's fine. You can use that if you want, but bear in mind that the lowest crossover point will depend on how loud you're playing the driver. And I'm talking about tweeters, but it's exactly the same about mid-ranges and the mid-bass. We're going to touch those as well. So the louder you play the driver, the higher the crossover you want. If you want like a normal tweeter to play like in SPL system, which is very, very loud, cross it at a 5K, cross it at 6K. If you're listening at like normal levels, 90 dB, very, very quiet, you can cross it a bit lower. You can cross like 2.5K. So the crossover point is going to depend on the loudness, because the higher you push the driver, the more excursion you're going to have. But as I mentioned, like a normal typical crossover point, something like 3.5K for 1.5-inch tweeter. Now, if we're talking about the mid-ranges, let's take, for example, this one. I set up a mid-range. So in my system, I have channel 1-2 tweeters, 3-4 mid-ranges, 5-6 woofers, because at the moment I have a 3-way connected. So let's choose channel 3 like that. So now there's nothing. For a mid-range, again, it depends on the size. A typical mid-range size is about 3.5 inch. Those drivers, again, depending on quality and everything, can play down to 200 or 300 Hertz. But just to be safe and not to push the drivers and kind of generalize, I want to say a 3.5 inch driver, you want to cross it no lower than 350 Hertz. So let's put 350 Hertz just like that. And again, 24 dB link with Riley. So this would be a typical for a normal driver. If you have a smaller mid-range, which is going to be like 2 or 2.5 inch, I would recommend a crossover of at least 500 Hertz, because the smaller the driver, the higher the crossover point. If you have a bigger mid-range, like a 4-inch or something, that one probably can play down to 200 or even lower, like 180 or something like that. But for a typical 3.5, we're going to put 350 Hertz. Probably 300 Hertz is going to be fine. And again, it depends how you're going to push it. If you're going to push it really, really loud, then probably 400. If you don't like your ears bleeding and you're listening on a normal level, probably like 250 can do it as well. So this is the high pass. Now for a mid-range, we need to play just a certain band pass. We don't need it to play all the way up, because if you're gonna leave your mid-range playing all the way up, those higher frequencies are gonna clash with the tweeter that you're playing. So obviously if you want loudness, then yes, you're gonna leave both of them on and you're gonna have loads of treble. But for SQ, we don't really need it. So what we need to do is we need the mid-range to let go of some frequencies, and then the tweeter is picking up from that point. So if you remember, we crossed these 3.5K. So we can do exactly the same for the mid-range. We're gonna go here and we're gonna put 3500. Just like that, and 24 dB, something like that. And now if I'm gonna enable channel 1 and channel 3, just to show you, we can see that the mid-range is playing this, then it kind of slowly drops off, and the tweeter is picking up from that frequency. And this 3.5K is what it's called a crossover frequency, where the drivers kind of cross over, because that's an X. Now, if you overlap the drivers, let me show you. If I'm going to choose, for example, 5000 Hertz, just like that, you can see the drivers are overlapping, the crossover frequency is higher, and if you sum these drivers, in the frequency response, you're going to have a bump, because they're overlapping and there's much more energy here. Now, if you're going to do the opposite, and I'm going to cross this at 2000 Hertz, like this, you're leaving like a gap in between the drivers, and then you're going to have a little dip. Now, this is not advisable, because what people do is, if they're missing some information somewhere, they overlap the crossovers and have that extra energy, but the reason why your frequencies are missing is not the crossovers, is the actual natural roll-off of the driver frequency response. We will talk about this later because it's more in depth. But for now, we're going to set at 3500 and we're going to leave it like that. So now we see our mid-range is playing that and our tweeter is playing that. Now, if we're going to go to the woofers, which in my case is going to be channel 5, this one, I'm going to enable channel 5 here just for you to show. The woofer is going to play band pass as well. Band pass, again, it has a high pass and it has a low pass. Now, what frequencies can a mid-bass play? Again, it depends on the driver. Let me show you a little bit. So in a typical door, you're going to fit 6.5-inch drivers. Sometimes you can fit 8. Now, the problem in my system is that those are 8-inch drivers, which is very not typical. And these are very not typical 6.5-inch drivers because they have much more X-Max. So a good starting point for any 6.5 driver, normal 6.5, not Pro Audio, it's going to be about 80 Hertz. So for this, I'm going to put 80 Hertz, just like that. Again, 24 dB link with Riley, something like this. You can see from 80 and up. And again, if we cross the mid-range at 350, we're going to cross the mid-bass at 350 as well. So we're going to put 350 and 24 dB slope. There we go. So this is going to be our mid-bass, mid-range, and a tweeter. Now, if we have a two-way system, as I mentioned, just the tweeter and the mid-bass, so we are not playing the mid-range at all, then we're going to cross our mid-bass driver at, you guessed it right, 3.5K, just like that. So the mid-bass in the doors are going to play all the way up to the tweeter, and then tweeter is going to take over. Now, this starting point of 80 Hertz high pass for the mid-bass is just a guide. Again, it depends on the driver. If you're going to have a Pro Audio mid-range driver, that will need a higher crossover, like 100, maybe 120 Hertz. But for a typical normal driver, 80 Hertz is fine. What I would recommend you to do, if you want to find a good crossover point that the driver is kinda doing okay, what I would recommend to do is set 80 Hertz in the very beginning, disable the tweeter in the DSP, have only the mid-bass playing, just like that, and cross it at maybe like 200 Hertz. Just not to bleed your ears. And what you're gonna do is you play some music. What I would recommend you to play is this one. This is your track, Billie Eilish, bad guy. This track, even when it starts, it has a lot of mid bass and a lot of kick, and basically it always rattles the door to pieces. So what you do, you play this song, you crank the volume up, and you feel how the driver is doing. Now, if you don't have any grills, you can literally feel the cone movement. So what I do for these ones as well, what I do, I just stick my fingers in there because I can reach the cone and I can feel how much the driver is moving. And then you start lowering this crossover point. So if on 80 hertz is doing fine, there's no distortion or nothing, in plays very, very nice. You lower it down to 75 and you see how it's doing then. If it's doing fine, lower it even lower, 70, and then at 70, you kind of start to feel that the cone is moving quite a lot. It's rattling. It doesn't sound good. You know that that crossover point is going to be too low for that driver. 6.5-inch driver should not play any bass. It plays only mid bass and the kick bass, so 80 is kind of normal, but plus minus 10 hertz, something like that. Exactly the same you have for audio mid ranges. If you set 120, so this one is probably going to be need a bit higher, let's say put 500 just to have this. If you set 120 and you can hear that it's distorting, it doesn't sound good, it sounds harsh, up the crossover, try 150. If it's distorting even then, try 180, and so on and so on, until you're going to find a crossover where the driver is not distorting and is playing comfortably in that range. So for this, we're going to go down to 80 because, again, typical 6.5 mid-bass driver, not a pro audio, it should be fine playing down to 80. Now, if you're going to cross it at 60, like that, you will be able to listen to it, but you wouldn't be able to crank it up full tilt. On normal levels, again, exactly the same as tweeters, exactly the same as mid-ranges. If on lower volumes, you can choose a lower crossover, but bear in mind that you cannot crank it up. If you want to crank it up, the crossover has to go up, because the main distortion that you have is when a driver is moving so much that it goes out of X max, it kind of runs out of excursion, and then you have those distortions. If the driver is kept in check, if the excursion is managed and it's within the magnetic gap, you're not going to have distortion. You will have, but it's not going to be audible at all. And audible distortion is not 1%, it's not 0.5%. Audible distortion is going to be like 5, 10, 15%. So when you hear the driver distorting, you know that it's way past the point where it's feel comfortable playing. So up the crossover point and let it play whatever it can play. Okay, so this is just basics. This is literally just to start your system running. So if we chose this 345 like that, and I have a tweeter, just like that. Now let's go to the subwoofer, which is going to be the channel 7 in my case. So most subwoofers will need only a low pass filter. Let's set up at 80 just to have it with the mid bass, and we're going to do 24 dB. Now, this, again, is just a starting point, because for subwoofers to integrate properly into the front, this is not correct. And I'm going to show you why with the measurements. We're going to prove it. But for now, just stick it the same. So you have 80, 3.5K. If you have a mid-range, is 350 or something like that. This is just basic guide just to give you a head start. If you have a ported subwoofer, you will need an infrasonic filter. So infrasonic filter, you have them in the amplifiers. If you have one on the amplifier, just leave it there and don't worry about it. If you run a full range amplifier, or you can disable it, you can enable it in the DSP. So what you have here, a high pass, you can set like 25 hertz, just like that, 24 dB, just like that. So this is going to be your infrasonic filter, and this is going to be your normal crossover. For sealed enclosures, you don't need the infrasonic. So in this case, you're just going to leave it off, just like that. Now, hopefully you know why you need an infrasonic filter, because below the tuning frequency, if your box is tuned at 30-35 hertz, somewhere there, if you play any kind of content below the tuning frequency, you're running a risk of damaging your subwoofer, because below the tuning frequency, the cone is out of phase with the port, and basically you crank it up and the driver is just going mad, but it doesn't play anything because everything is canceling out. So in order to prevent that, you enable an infrasonic. So infrasonic, usually you have it, they say half an octave below your tuning frequency, but it's just a guide as well. So again, an octave is going to be doubling or halving of a frequency. So if you have 100 hertz, 1 octave up is going to be 200 and 1 octave down is going to be 50. If your box is tuned at about 35 hertz, half an octave down is going to be something like 22 or 20 hertz something. If you have big subwoofers and you don't listen loud, I know that in SPL is not very common, but in SQ is extremely common. I have an 18-inch and I don't play in really loud. You don't need an infrasonic, even if you run a ported box, because infrasonic is a common sense check. Like, if you know what you're doing with the drivers, you don't really need it. But if you want to go mental and don't care about anything, yeah, you kind of need the infrasonic filter. And this is basically your two-way system. You have a subwoofer that is crossed 25 infrasonic, 80 into the mid bass, then 80 to 3.5K into the tweeter, and 3.5K all the way up there. If you're going to have a three-way, we're going to put this one at 350, and then we're going to enable one of the mid-ranges. This is going to be your three-way system, where everything is kind of the same. It's just you add another speaker in the mid-range from 350 to 3.5K. Now, why do we need a mid-range? I will show you everything with a measurement, but as I mentioned, this is just a basic guide. Once you have your crossover set, so you do set everything in pairs. In the DSP software, if you're gonna press this one, sync, and you can sync left to right or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Basically what it does, it copies everything from left to right. So you have both of your tweeters, and I'm gonna have exactly the same. Then for the mid-ranges, exactly the same for both. And on the mid-bass, exactly the same for both. In proper SQ with like proper good tune, the crossover points between left and right are not necessarily the same. But for this one, for simplicity, we're gonna say that they're the same, and we're gonna keep it like that. So we can use it in pairs. Now, after the crossovers are set, we're going to do a very, very basic time alignment. If we're going to go to delay, which is here you have all of these things. These are your speakers and these are your delays. So what is a delay and why do we need it? When we sit in a car, we have left side, we have right side. And obviously you, American people, are gonna have everything mirror image. So for you, my right side is your wrong side. But the main thing is that the speakers on your side, wherever you're sitting, are closer to you than the ones on the passenger side. So in order for the sound wave to reach me, the listener, at the same time from both of these speakers, I need this side, in my case, in your case it's going to be that side, to be delayed. They should be like, the sound should hold back a little bit until that is going to go a little bit first, and then both of them are going to reach me at the same time. And we achieve that using the delay. Now, one thing to bear in mind, in the delay you have milliseconds, you have inches, and you have centimeters. So these inches and centimeters, which is a distance unit, is not the distance to the speaker. If you're going to enter the distances to speakers here, the delay is not going to be correct. Some software, such as Helix and all the other ones, they will calculate and subtract everything. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so this is a calculator that I kind of use sometimes. It's called Jazzy's Tuning Companion. You can download it for free, and there's loads of these calculators online. And in this calculator, if you're going to enter the distances, it's going to give you a delay in milliseconds, and that is kind of subtracted from your furthest thing. So for example, in this system, which delay 0 is the right mid bass, which is the furthest distance. If you have the furthest speaker, that doesn't need any delay, and all the other speakers that are slightly closer, those speakers will need delay. So you need to use one of these calculators if you want to use the actual distances to the speakers. Basically, you take a tape measure, you measure it, you enter this, and then we're going to have these values in milliseconds. Those values you're going to enter here. But for just beginning, just starting, what I would recommend you to do is follow like a basic rule of thumb, if you want to call it, which is not really correct, but it kind of gives you kind of normal results. So the difference between left and right is a little bit more than 1 millisecond in time. So the right speakers in my case, in your case, is going to be the left speakers, need to be delayed by about 1.1, 1.2 milliseconds. And then your image is going to be closer to the center where it's supposed to be. So in your case, which you're going to be American people, if I'm going to enter on the left tweeter here, millisecond 1.2, and the mid bass, which is channel this one, 1.2, and I'm gonna leave everything else the same. You're gonna have kind of something more or less in the center. This is for a typical two-way system. In my system, which is right hand driven, I would need to enter those delays on the right side. So as a guide, just as a guide, it's not really correct. Just put 1.2 milliseconds on your driver's side drivers, and you're gonna have something similar. Then in the next videos, we're gonna talk about how to set up the delay more properly. Subwoofer in most cases is gonna be in the very, very back where it will need zero delay. So again, this is just a startup. And after this, after you set your crossovers and these very initial basic delays, you can play your system and you can play it kind of safe. Now, obviously, you're going to hear that it doesn't sound nice because the tweeters might be too loud. There might be no really good mid bass. There might be frequencies that kind of stand out or it's a bit harsh. That we're going to cover in the next video where we're going to talk about basic EQ functions, how to find the frequencies and how to adjust them. But this is just literally, you bought the DSP, you connect it, how to set up the crossovers, basic time alignment, and just to keep you running so you wouldn't have to wait another week or two until you're gonna play with everything else. So it is kind of a long video. I do apologize for this, but these things cannot be kept very short. You cannot just tell stuff without explaining why you're doing this. That's why my videos go in extreme detail about every little single thing. So if you want to learn more, if you want to learn more about crossovers, how to choose the correct ones, watch my videos about the crossover. If you want to do some advanced stuff, watch my advanced videos about tuning, but we're going to take it baby steps, very, very slowly. This is kind of your homework. Set up the crossovers first, and in the next video, we will be talking about the EQ, the basic EQ, and how to find some pesky frequencies and get rid of them. And just a heads up, in the future, we will be tuning using an RTA and a microphone. Is going to be everything proper, but now we're just starting very, very basic. If you have any questions, please pop them in the comments below down the video, and thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next one.